Last night we're in the book of Ecclesiastes. We're down in chapter 3, beginning really at about verse 16. Begin looking there. Solomon is adding now here to his list of frustrations. The things that have frustrated him in life has caused him to draw the conclusion that everything is vain. And he adds to that here, beginning at verse 16 and 17, it says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work." So here's something he talks about that frustrates him again. How can these things be in a world that's been created by God and so forth? But he says, I saw under the sun in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. What's the place of judgment that he's talking about? Where do you expect to find judgment being made? In a court. And so, then you expect there in a court that you're going to find righteous judgment. The law, God was so careful in the law and explaining to His people about this, and especially those that were going to be in positions of authority, were called upon to make judgments. God says you've got to make sure that you don't show favoritism in court. You don't show favoritism to someone who might be able to benefit you in some way. Someone that's wealthy, you may want to rule in his favor, figuring he might reward you in some way and give you money for doing that. But God says you've got to make sure you give righteous judgment. You don't deal it out to those who are wealthy, to those who are famous, just because of that. You've got to determine what's right, and also you would expect to find that in the courtroom. But Solomon is frustrated because he says there in that place of judgment, wickedness was there. And evidently, again, he's talking about this fact that in that courtroom where you look to find justice, instead of finding that, you're finding people who are wicked, who may be the judge in that sense, being wicked. He may favor someone else, and so a person who's guilty may go free, and a person who's innocent may get punished. Boy, aren't we glad we don't have things like that today? But you still find it. So many times, in trials, those who are innocent maybe are punished, and those who are guilty so many times are set free. And so it's frustrating to Solomon. It's frustrating to us today. And so we can understand maybe his feelings here and why he is feeling like that, and all these things that are going on, that frustration that comes from it. And the New Testament, I think, teaches that same thing, about that. Romans chapter 2, verses 5 and 8. The Apostle Paul says, "But in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourselves wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds, eternal life to those who by patient continuance in doing good seek for glory, honor, and immortality. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation, and wrath." What you find here in this life, in the court system, wherever you go, you're going to find those times when innocent people are punished and the wicked people are set free. But Solomon says here, he understands this, and he says, "I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work." And he's exactly right. And that's what Paul is talking about here. There is a time when everything's going to be made right, when everybody will have to stand in judgment before God. And in that instance, those who are innocent will be rewarded. Those who have been obedient to God are going to be blessed, but those who have been disobedient are going to be punished. There'll be no escape. There's no way, there's no mountain. And this is something else that I've noticed two different times just in recent reading of the Bible. I've noticed two different times where it's emphasized that no amount of money is going to be able to buy your escape from judgment. Doesn't matter how rich you are. When we stand before God in judgment, all the money in the world is not going to buy our salvation or keep us from being punished. And so those things are going to be corrected. Many years ago when I was a student in college, I was working one summer out at Hannah Steel Corporation. And there was a young man working there, just like several of us who were in college working during the summers trying to make some money. It was a young Jewish man there. And I was talking to him one day about did he believe that there was going to be a judgment someday. And he said, yes, he did. And his reason why was, he said, it only stands to reason that God is going to correct all the mistakes that have been made. That all the people who've been guilty who've gotten free are going to have to answer for that, for what they've done wrong. And the innocent who have been punished, they're going to be vindicated. You think about in the New Testament about those disciples and all the things that they suffered for their faithfulness to God. They were hated, they were imprisoned, and many of them were put to death. But someday they're going to be vindicated in the courtroom of God. And all of that's going to be made right, and they're going to be justified. And so he's frustrated, Solomon is, by what's happening in this life. But his only hope is that someday men will stand before God, and God's going to correct all of that, and things are going to be made right. One other passage in that regard, well, I thought I'd put it up here and I hadn't. Matthew 16:27 says, for the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. So there's a time coming when it will be corrected. Now as he goes on here in Ecclesiastes 3, beginning at verse 18 and going through 22, I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men which go upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth? So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will have to happen after that? Here's a passage that several different groups, but especially I think, with Jehovah's Witnesses, adhere to, with the sense that this passage is teaching that man doesn't have an eternal soul. Man is just like the animals. When an animal dies, what happens to it? Nothing. It's the, quote, soul of the animal is just its breath. And we'll look at that in a minute, the meaning of the words that are used for this. And so they believe, that that's the way it is with a person. When an animal dies, he stops breathing, and that's what happens to us. That's our breath. That's our soul. That's all our soul is the breath. And so that's going to happen, and the body will go back to the dust from which it was taken. And so that's it. There's no difference between man and the animal. And they use this strongly in their teachings about this. And they're not the only ones, but I'm sure those who are unbelievers, period, don't believe in God at all, would be those who would take the same position. They'd say, well, look at what Solomon said. He's the wisest man that ever lived, and he's teaching you there's no difference between you and the animal. What happens to one is going to happen to another. And as he puts it there, he says, who knows the spirit of the sons of men which go upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth? The idea, who knows? But it's the same thing with man as it is with the animals, that they're going to do that. And so, he talks about this, that God is testing men maybe here and this to determine what they're going to be like and how they're going to receive these things. How are we going to understand these verses, though? Does man have an eternal spirit? Yes. Now, but how do you explain that? That man is just like the animals. I don't believe animals have an eternal spirit. Animals are not created in the image of God. Excuse me, I've gotten into trouble, hadn't I? Yeah. Well, not exactly. If it wasn't for Him, we wouldn't have but one place to go. But you know, you stop and think about it. Man is comprised of three things: the body, soul, and spirit. Paul talks about that in the letter to the church at Thessalonica. But what does he mean by this? Well, when he talks about the body, that's the word there, soma is the Greek word for that. And in the Bible, that word refers, talking about the physical body, refers to it as the temple, 1 Corinthians 6 and 19. It's referred to as the home, 2 Corinthians 5, 6, and 9. It's also called the outward man, 2 Corinthians 4:16. And from the Bible we know the body is weak, Matthew 26:41. You remember Jesus says the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. So this physical body is a weak thing. It comes from a human father, Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 9, and we'll get to that later. That we all have a father of the flesh that we come from. We know that this body is going to decay, 2 Corinthians 4:16 again. And it dies, James 2 and verse 26. And when it dies, it returns to the earth, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. The body will go back to the dust from whence it was taken. And so that's that physical body that we have. It's going to be buried, and it's also going to be resurrected. The physical body is what's buried, and the physical body will also be resurrected. 1 Corinthians 15, 42, 43, and also verse 54. So that's one part of us. That's that physical body. And the physical body we have is like the animals. Each one, when we die, that body is going to go back to the dust, and the body of an animal will go back to dust. Yes, sir? Yeah, but still, you know, they're going to argue. They're both flesh. They're going to die, and the flesh is going to go back to the dust. He made the fowls, and then he made the man. Yeah. The difference there, I thought you were going to get to, we're going to talk about that in a minute, is that man's created in the image of God. There's something about man that's different from the animals, but it's like God. Now, God's not a physical being, so it's not this physical body that's like God. And when this body dies, it does go back to dust, but the Ecclesiastes writer Solomon also says later in chapter 12, the spirit returns unto God who gave it. So there's a distinction between this physical body and the spirit. But now the next thing it talks about is the soul. And the word for soul in Greek is psyche. And this is a word that can be used in a variety of different ways in regard to it. It normally refers to the natural part of man. Sometimes it simply refers to life itself. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 20, and this is something that always puzzled me, especially when I was a young man. I did not know a whole lot about these things. But when you look at that, I'm going to read that verse here in just a second. Chapter 12 of Luke. Now, I've got a revised standard here, and maybe I'll ask somebody to read it too in the King James Version, because it's a little bit different there. So look at that. Luke chapter 12 and verse 20. Well, maybe this will be it. For God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Now that's that word psyche, soul. But somebody have a different translation from that? For Luke chapter 12 and verse 20. Life. Tonight your life will be required of you. And so I didn't understand that, the soul. is translating one, and the other, your life is why. Well, that word soul, suke, can and many times does in the Bible refer simply to the physical life of a person. And so your life is going to require you. You're going to die. And so your life is being required of you. But it's the word soul, suke. And then the next word is the word spirit, pneuma. Now this is a word that, again, it can have different meanings to it. But just look at the Greek word there itself, pneuma. And there are a lot of words in English that are derived from that. You ever heard of a pneumatic drill? What kind of a drill is that? Compressed air. And that's what that word refers, pneuma. It can be translated as air or as breath. God breathed into man the breath of life, and he became a living soul. But the word pneuma can mean breath. And again, that's something else, that some religions hold on to and say, well, that's all it is. You don't have an eternal spirit. You just have your breath, And that's what the Bible talks about. The body without the spirit is dead. When your breath is gone, you're no longer alive. And so that's the idea that they get to. But that word spirit, again, has a reference not just to the breath of a person, but to the eternal part of man. Now, that part that lives on forever and ever. When it's used concerning that word spirit in the Bible, number one, Luke chapter 24 and verse 39. This is when Jesus has appeared to his disciples after the resurrection. And they're startled when they see him. Well, if you know somebody has died and some days later you see them, what do you think you've seen? A ghost, And so they're startled when they see him. And what did Jesus tell them to do? Why? Touch him. Why? Yeah, because a ghost doesn't have flesh and bone as you see I have. So there's his physical body raised up from the dead. But he makes a distinction between that and the spirit. I'm not a spirit, a ghost, as the King James translates it. I'm not a spirit, but the physical body here. So the spirit is not flesh and bone. And so that body is what goes down to the earth and decays, but that's not the spirit of man. Furthermore, the spirit is eternal. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16. Again, we kind of mentioned that a while ago, but look again. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 16. Someone have that? You can read it. Okay. The outward man, that's the body. It perishes. But the inward man, what's the inward man? It's the spirit. And it's renewed day by day. I remember, Jerry talking about an uncle of his that had passed away, but as he was dying, this was a passage that he had asked to be read to him again and again. Though the outward man perishes, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. There's hope there for us. When we're approaching death, we know it's coming. Yeah, this body's going to die, but that inward man is made stronger day by day by our relationship with God. There's that inward man that we have. That spirit that he talks about is invisible, John chapter 3 and verse 8. It is the part of man that is made in God's image, Genesis 1, 26 and 27. It lives within the body in this life, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 15. God is the Father of our spirit. And remember we talked about we have fathers of our flesh. All of us have a father that is the father of our physical body. But our spirit, God's the father of our spirit. So there's a distinction made between the spirit and the body, and it's more than just the breath. It is that which makes us in the image of God. God is spirit, and they that worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. God is an eternal being. That's what the spirit is. And so we have a spirit like God. We're created in His image, given that spirit, and that spirit is eternal that we have from God. God forms the Spirit within us. That's Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 1. It returns to God when the body dies, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. And in death, the Spirit retains its consciousness. Remember in Luke chapter 16, the rich man and Lazarus both die. And yet, even though they are dead physically, their spirit lives on. The spirit of the rich man, he dies and he's buried, and he ends up in a place of torment. And the poor man, Lazarus, when he dies, his spirit is carried to the bosom of Abraham. And there, in that place, they're able to communicate. The rich man is able to communicate with Abraham and to hear Abraham respond to him. They're still alive in one sense. The physical part of them is dead, but the spirit is still alive. I remember a number of years ago going to Memphis, Tennessee, and we were going into a museum they had there about the Indians in that area. And as we was going in to the museum, we found some men out there. They were trying to put in a new sidewalk there, but as they were digging to put that sidewalk in, they found some more bones of Indians. And they were talking about how that these people had probably been alive there something like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And I thought, yeah, that's their body. But their spirit is still alive somewhere. The spirit is different from that body, and it's something that is eternal, and it retains its consciousness even after death. It is immortal. 2 Corinthians 4:26, chapter 5 and verse 12, 2 Peter 2 and verse 9. And so there's a big difference there. And in commenting about the difference between the soul and the spirit, listen to what Brother Guyan Woods said about that. Brother Wood says that the word soul, as it relates to man, is a general term, and the word spirit is a specific term. The word spirit refers to the immortal nature of man. Because the word soul is a general term, we must allow the context to decide what the proper meaning should be. The word soul can refer to the whole person, as in Acts 2:41. It can refer to the physical life that it has in common with the lower creation, Psalm 78 and verse 50. And it also can refer to the intellectual nature and higher spiritual nature, 1 Corinthians 2:14, and thus synonymously with spirit. The word soul and spirit sometimes can be used interchangeably when talking about the mortal part of a man, that which is eternal. So you have to look at the context in which it is found to determine what the word soul is talking about. Is it talking about just physical life? Is it talking about the whole nature of man, or is it talking about that spiritual part that lives forever? And the context will determine that. So these verses that we read here, this is not something that Solomon has put in here to cause people to doubt or to make people think that, you don't have an eternal spirit, that you don't have anything distinct about you. It's all the same as all the animals have. He puts this here for other reasons. And it may be based upon, his wisdom. Is this by the limited wisdom that he has? Because God had not revealed everything to them that He's revealed to us today. In fact, I wanted to look at this passage where Paul writes to Timothy. We've talked about it before. But someone turn to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 10. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 10. Who's got it? Raise your hand and let you. All right, go ahead, Charlotte, please.
But it has now been revealed through the appearing of our Savior Christ Jesus, who has destroyed death and has brought life and immortality to
Okay. Christ is the one who's brought life and immortality to light. Those people in the Old Testament did not have the knowledge that you and I have today in regard to that. There were a lot of different ideas that people had. We talked about this last week. You know, Job, curious about that and want to know there's hope for a tree if it dies, but what about man? There's a hope that they had for it, but they did not have any knowledge of it. It had not been revealed to them. Christ is the one who brought life and immortality to light, so that today we can know that man does have an eternal part of him, that part that's going to live on forever and ever. And so the latter part here then in this chapter deals with that, or verse 16 through 22, about man. And man is not the same as animals. Man has that eternal part of him that's in the image of God. Now when we get to chapter 4, everything's going to be just a little bit different. You're going to change gears again in some of the things that he talks about in chapter 4. Going to deal primarily here with those who are oppressed by others who are more powerful. Now again, this is not anything unusual. We see the same thing happening today. That those people who have power and have control many times will oppress others who don't have the power that they have. And so I just want to be looking here at these first 3 verses. Solomon says, "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun." So switching gears here. "And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." And this again becomes one of the things that frustrates him and causes him to come to this conclusion over and over again that everything is vain. Vanity of vanities because of the way these things are. But again, this is the way it's always been. There have always been those people who have power who will oppress other people. We think about in our nation and the slavery that went on for all those years, not just here in the South, but throughout our country. And those people who were people of power and had money, they purchased people to be their slaves, and they controlled them. They oppressed them. And so what he's talking about that he saw in his own days is the same things that still happens in our world today. Even if there's not a form of slavery, there are still those who are in power who have the ability, because of their power they have, to oppress other people, to make things hard for them and yet be wonderful for them. And so when Solomon looks at this and he considers this oppression, he says, look, the tears of the oppressed. You can see how they're suffering and what's being done to them, but there's no comforter for them. The ones that are around them are the ones who are oppressing them. They don't have anybody to offer comfort. Nobody to wipe away their tears and care for them. But we do know, as David expressed to God, keep all my tears in a bottle. God is aware of the suffering that goes on in this world and of the oppression that comes to people and how they are being treated. And God's aware of it. And again, like the other things he's talked about, someday that's going to be corrected. And everything's going to be made right. And so he sees this, and it bothers him that people are oppressed and there's no comforter. Therefore, he says, I praise the dead who are already dead. What Solomon is saying here is, number one, he said, the dead are better than the living. Now, why would that be the case? Why would you say the dead are better than the living? Right. Any depression that they may have suffered, that's over now because they're dead. And there's nothing there to be suffered, no oppression from anybody else in that regard. I had a look in Luke chapter 12 for just a minute. Luke chapter 12 and verses 4 and 5. Who's got that for us? Luke 12, 4 and 5. All right, Billy. Don't fear those who can kill the body. Why? Because after you're dead, they can't do anything more to hurt you. And that's what Solomon, blessed are the dead over the living, because the dead are not going to be oppressed anymore. They're not going to be hurt. Nobody can do any more bad to them. But if you're going to fear anybody, Jesus said, fear the one that not only can kill you physically, but can destroy you eternally in hell. That's the one you need to fear in this regard. And so that's why he says the dead are better off than the living, because the living are still going to be suffering. They're still going to be oppressed. But the dead are free from that now. And then he goes a step further and he says, the one who has never been born is better than the dead or the living. Now, why is that the case? Yeah, they've never had to suffer, period. If you've never been born, you don't have to suffer any at all. Turn over to the book of Job for just a moment. Job chapter 3 and verse 3. We know about Job, and we know about his suffering, what he endured. Suffered in just about every respect you can see. He loses his wealth, he loses his children, he loses his health, and then finally, in essence, he loses his wife, who tells him, why don't you just curse God and die? But what did he say in chapter 3 and verse 3? Okay. What's Job talking about there? What is he wishing for? Yeah, he's wishing that he had never been born. Why? Well, if I'd never been born, I wouldn't have been suffering all these things that I'm enduring right now. And there are a lot of people that believe that a life of senseless suffering is not worth living. That's why some people believe in this idea of euthanasia, of putting people to death like that. Because it's not worth living with senseless suffering. And Job saying, listen, it would have been better. The best thing that could happen to anybody is to never be born. Because if you've never been born, you'll never have to suffer. Well, that sounds pretty pessimistic, doesn't it? And, sir? Yeah, you would never have existed. Job saying you'd be better off because you wouldn't be suffering. But you wouldn't know it, would you? But look in the New Testament. I think there are a number of passages in the New Testament that would help us understand better about that. That's Job 3:3. All right, Philippians 4 and 4. Paul said, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Number one, it's possible, even in a life of suffering, that you can find reasons to rejoice. Paul suffered greatly. He talks about that at length in his letter to the Corinthians, about the things that he suffered in this life. But he could find reasons to rejoice. 2 Corinthians 12:10. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul can actually find encouragement in the suffering that he was going through and enduring in life. But there's one passage especially that Paul makes that settles this question for me. In Romans 8:18, Paul said, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The idea seems to me there that what Paul is saying is the opportunity to be able to live eternally in heaven with God is worth the risk of whatever you might suffer in this life. But in reality, it's not a risk. It's not a gamble. It's simply a matter of choice. If we choose to live for God and obey Him, we will live with Him eternally in heaven. And when we get to heaven, you look back on anything you suffered in this life, and you're going to think, it's not right to compare the two. Because what we've suffered cannot compare with the blessings we have here in glory with God. And so, Job, as much as I understand Job with all that he suffered and wishing that he had never been born, I think if you could talk to Job tonight, he'd tell you, I was wrong. You know, the glory that he's enjoying now, you know, what he suffered, he'd say, can't compare with this. And it should never be used as a basis for wishing you had never lived, or to think that a person ought to take their own life. Sufferings of this present age, Paul said, are not worthy to be compared with the glory we'll have. The next problem he looks at here is this chapter, verses 4 through 6, a problem of envy. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. You know, Solomon has talked about a lot, and he'll mention it again too, about, you know, that what you need to do in life is to enjoy this life and enjoy the things that you're able to do, the work you do and the toil that you put forth. You need to be able to enjoy that. But he says again, is the thing about it, he says, for all the toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. What does he talk about? For all the work that you do, for every skillful work you do, you're envied by your neighbor. You ever envied your neighbor? Now you probably have, but you don't want to admit it. I mean, you know, you look at your neighbor who's got something really nice, you know, and you think, I wish I had that. You know, might be jealous, might be envious of them for what they have. And what happens, and I think what Solomon is getting at is, because of that, when we see something that our neighbor's got that's really nice, and we think, man, I'd like to have that, and we're envious of it, then maybe we'll put forth a little more toil, a little more effort, so that we can have what we got. And we call that what? Keeping up with the Joneses, you know? And every year I'm having to change this every time I teach this. I started off, you know, if your neighbor had a $10,000 car, then you've got to get a $50,000. Well, you ain't going to do that anymore. So if your neighbor's got a $30,000 car and you think, man, I got to get one $40,000, you know, I got to keep up with him. And if my neighbor buys his wife a mink stove, then I'll have to buy my wife a mink coat. You know, we got to, you know, become envious of people and want to one-up them and do that. And so he says that's the problem. You know, he emphasizes this idea of needing to work and be joyful in the work you have and enjoy that. But yet instead he says we find out if we just do all that good and produce good stuff, we're envied by our neighbor, and then if we're not careful, then we become envious of them, and we're wasting all our time doing all that work. Not working so that I can think about I've completed a job well done. I've done something that's going to be beneficial to help other people. Nothing of that nature. It's just I've got to do this, and I've got to do the best job I can so I can have what my neighbor's got and maybe have something better than what they've got. And so again, he sees that, you know, as a vanity and a grasping for the wind. All of that is so futile when we behave that way. But many times that's what we do. Maybe you've got great talents, but you don't want to use that talent just to be able to help other people. We want to do it to enrich ourselves and because of our envy of what our neighbor has or something of that nature. And so all of that goes on and on and on. And so he's concerned about that, the problem that it causes. And he makes the statement, he says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Now, contrast to the person who works like this so he can have more like his neighbor or better, you've got the man who's a fool who becomes lazy and doesn't do anything. And as a result of not doing anything, what happens? Well, the statement he makes he says he consumes his own flesh. I think the idea is when a person doesn't do anything, and they just lay around the house, you know, and waste whatever they've got till all of it's gone, they're hurting themselves. I don't know if it'd be exactly like buildings, but you know, when buildings are not occupied, it seems like they decay so much quicker and eventually collapse. And when men are not occupied and we're not busy doing things that we need to be doing, we're destroying ourselves. God intended for us to work. When God created man and put him in the garden, he gave him responsibility of tilling the garden. He had a responsibility, that work that he needed to do. Now, it was beneficial in that time in the sense that, you know, he didn't have to contend with the thorns and all. He didn't have to earn his living by the sweat of his brow. It was a lot easier then. But still, there was work that he had to do. And people need to do that. And Paul says, if a man will not work, if you're talking about a person who's capable of working, if a man will not work, what? Don't let him eat. You know, if you don't want to enable him to continue his laziness, and his laziness is going to end up in his own destruction. Story I heard a long, long time ago, I think it was Jerry Clower told it, about a woman who had a pet squirrel and had him in a cage there, kept in the house, and she would feed it pecans. And she noticed how that squirrel would have to chew through those shells to get to it. And she felt sorry for him having to do all that. So she went out and bought shelled pecans to feed him. And that's all she gave him. He had those shelled pecans to eat. And what happens? Well, in time, his teeth, those incisors, began to grow because chewing through that shell to get to the food he needed kept those incisors filed down. But eating all this, he wasn't doing that, so those teeth were going along, and pretty soon they'd gotten down low over the, so he couldn't eat it all. So she went back to give him shelled pecans in the shell, but he wouldn't eat them. You know, no. He's had the good life. He's had it given to him, and now that's all he wants. And so he said she loved that poor squirrel to death. You know, well, if you know, we got to be careful in life about it. We need to work, but that work is for our benefit. And if we don't work, we become lazy. In essence, what we're going to do is we're going to destroy ourselves. Yeah. Yeah. And it's going to bring about, you know, more and more problems when we don't do what we need to be doing to work as we should. Now, the next section, our time's gone, but our next section we have is my favorite passage in the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'll talk about that, Lord willing, next time, and the lessons that we can learn from that, and that's going to be beginning at verse 8 and going through verse 12. So let's have a word of prayer at this time, and we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for your love and care that allows us the privilege of being your children, of having times like this to be with others of your children, to study together from your word. We pray that, Father, from this we'll be strengthened, encouraged, and be made stronger in our life of service to Thee, and that by Thy grace and mercy we can be with Thee someday in heaven forever and ever. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.